Instruments Around the World, a selection of instruments from every continent, compiled by author and composer Andy Jackson. Talking with Andy Jackson is Jim Smith, Director of Music at the Royal Grammar School in Worcester. We begin with the sound of a flute from the Andes of South America.
Now, there were a number of instruments in that extract. Which one are we actually listening to?
Well, the one that's most important in Andean music is the Quena, which is the flute sound that you heard at the top. There are other instruments in that recording. There's a drum, of course, which started it off and then speeded it up halfway through, and also various types of plucked stringed instruments, the guitar, and an instrument called a charango, which is made out of an armadillo shell.
And how is the Quena played?
It's not like our Western flute. It's held more like a whistle or a recorder, so it points down in front. But it doesn't have a mouthpiece that you blow into. It's just got a little notch in the end, and you blow across that notch. It's actually very, very difficult to play.
That sounded quite an ancient piece of music. Is this instrument used in modern times as well?
Oh yes, it's the foremost folk instrument in the Andes, and perhaps in the whole of South America. But also it is a very old instrument. Examples of it have been excavated going back well over 1,000 years. It used to be made out of bones, often shin bones of your enemies. It was thought to give you great power over your enemy if you could play a flute made out of his shin bone. But nowadays it tends to be made out of plastic piping or out of another type of bone, perhaps a llama.
Now, the first example sounded like a very old piece of music. Can we hear the instrument also played in a more modern vein?
Yes, the first example was a traditional piece of folk music. To say it's very old, it's difficult to know exactly how old it is, but certainly it is traditional music. We'll now listen to a piece by a modern folk composer, and you'll hear that it has a much more contemporary sound to it.
So from South America, we're off to Japan.
That's right, and from a wind instrument to a stringed instrument.
To my Western ears, that sounds like an out-of-tune guitar.
Well, what it actually is an in-tune Koto, and the reason it sounds like an out-of-tune guitar to you is that you've been used to hearing Western music, which is tuned in our way. obviously Japanese music has its own way of being in tune.
And is it composed or is it traditional folk music?
That particular piece was composed by somebody called Kengyo Yatsuhashi, and he lived from 1614 to 1685, so that's 17th century music, which is still being played today in exactly the same way as it was composed.
Now, in about that period in the West, the virginals was the instrument for young ladies to play, just as the piano was in Victorian times. Is the koto the Japanese equivalent?
Very much so, yes. It is played by young ladies. It's thought to be a marriageable property if a young lady has musical attributes. It actually started in what was known as the Edo period of Japanese history, which started in the 17th century, when there were a lot of young ladies who were held as hostages in the capital city. The idea was that if they were in the capital city, their parents wouldn't cause trouble in the countryside. And so there were a lot of bored young ladies around, and they turned to music as a way of passing the time.
No television in those days.
It certainly wasn't.
Can we hear some more?
Yes. This next example is called Flower Viewing at Daigo, and you hear now the use of the koto not as a solo instrument, but to accompany singing, and this is a very important part of the koto's use.
That's a bit different. Where are we now?
We're in Ghana in West Africa, and that's a pair of drums called Atumpan.
Drums always seem to go in pairs, don't they? I'm thinking of bongos, nakas, the Indian tabla, timpani.
They do seem to. In Africa, interestingly, the pair of drums is often referred to as male and female. In this case, it's the lower pitch, larger drum that is the male drum, but that's not always the case. Some of them, the larger drum is the female.
But they're played by one person only, are they?
Yes, this particular example is one person playing two drums with sticks.
I don't know if I've been watching too many Tarzan films lately, but I'm always inclined to associate drums with the sending of messages.
Drums are used to send messages. Obviously, the sound travels over a long distance, and they can be used to copy the rhythms of speech. So to some extent, you can actually produce a sound which will carry the meaning of words. It's very limited, of course, and these instruments are used to send messages, but their main use nowadays is as part of a drum ensemble.
Like our pop music drum sets?
Yes, but in this case played by several people on different instruments, not one person playing lots of instruments. We'll listen to an example now, shall we?
I must confess that's beginning to sound a little boring to me. Do people actually sit down and listen to that?
No, they wouldn't sit and listen to it. This is music which has a particular function in the society. People would use that music at some sort of celebration or perhaps a funeral. They would use it to dance to sing to. So this is music which is not listened to for itself. It's music which has a very particular function.
Like organ music before church?
I'd thought that's a good parallel, yes.
Were those drums all Atumpan?
No, there were different types of drums there, and some instruments that weren't drums. There was that very high metallic sound, which was created by hitting a cowbell with a stick.
OK, I know what they sound like now. What do they look like? What are they made of?
They're very large, so large they have to be put on the ground and held up in frames. They're made out of hollowed-out tree trunks with a membrane stretched over, which is, of course, the part that actually makes the sound. And traditionally, the membrane would have been made out of an elephant's ear. And, of course, throughout the world, instruments are made out of animal skins, often.
Like bagpipes?
Yes, and in fact there's a bagpipe that comes from Hungary called the Duda, which is made out of a whole sheep or a goat or even a whole dog. The drones are stuck into the legs, where the legs would be, and the chanter, the part that you play tunes on, comes out of the neck.
So that's a little different from the Scottish bagpipe that we know so well.
It is different in many ways. The type of reed it has that makes the sound is different, and the function, the use to which that music is put is rather different. It's not a military instrument, for instance, whereas the bagpipes we usually associate with military music.
It's more a pastoral instrument.
It is. It's played by shepherds, perhaps miners, gypsies, peasants. Traditionally would have been played by that type of person.
Now, Bartók was probably the best known of all Hungarian composers. Was he influenced by this instrument at all?
Very much so. The influence of the Duda in Western classical music goes back a long way. There's even elements of it in some of the music of Haydn and Beethoven in the Pastoral Symphony, but Bartók made extensive use of the sound, using the drone sound, and also the way in which he fits his music together using very, very short snatches of melody called motifs and adding them together to create an accumulating sound, which is very much like music played on the Duda, which we'll listen to now.
That sounds like medieval music.
It is very old music, though that particular tune was written in the 16th century. And in fact, the playing of the Duda fell into disuse at the beginning of this century.
Why was that?
There were various reasons. One was that the occasions on which it was usually played were social occasions when people wanted to display their social position and prestige. So having one bagpiper was not actually much of an advertisement, whereas if you could hire a whole band of gypsy musicians, this was rather better for you. So people would hire a band of maybe 6 people, which would be a clarinetist, 3 or 4 violinists, a bass player, somebody playing a cymbalom, which is a type of zither. And these instrumentalists gradually displaced the Duda, so it fell. It was not used at all for some time. And then, since about the 1950s, there's been a revival of Duda playing in Hungary. And so the next example I'd like us to listen to is a piece of modern virtuoso bagpipe playing.
Now, this is going to be rather a longer extract, isn't it? Is there anything special we should be listening out for?
I think you can concentrate on the quality of the sound, which is quite unusual in Western music, and you might almost think it sounds oriental, the way in which the piece gradually gathers momentum as it goes through, and towards the end you actually wonder how one person can produce quite so many notes.
Mm. Let's go off on our travels again then. What on earth was that?
That was a didgeridoo from Australia. It's a type of trumpet.
It doesn't sound anything like a trumpet.
No, it doesn't. We call it a trumpet because of the way it's played rather than what it's made out of.
And how is it made?
Well, actually, it's not really made at all. It's found. The Aboriginal players of the didgeridoo, when they need a new one, they sort of go on a walk and look for a long branch which has been hollowed out by termites. And that branch actually is the didgeridoo. They may do a very little to it. They may put a mouthpiece of beeswax or resin that they'll blow into, and they may decorate it.
So it sounds easy to find and also fairly easy to play?
It's easy to get a sound out of, but to play well requires years of very careful practice.
So what is it actually used for?
It's mainly used in rituals, to accompany singing mainly, but it can be used as a solo instrument too. One interesting use of it is imitating animals. Now, obviously, the Australian Aborigines are very close to nature. They rely on nature and on understanding nature for their way of life. And so they try to make the same sounds as animals with their music. This example we're going to listen to now is of the didgeridoo imitating a dingo, which is the Australian wild dog.
That's amazing. Was that just one player?
That was one player, and the variety of sound is created by the fact that they practice very hard, and they have a number of very sophisticated techniques that they use when playing the didgeridoo, which enables them to produce this huge variety of sound.
That playing sounds continuous. When do they find time to breathe?
It is virtually continuous, and they breathe at the same time as they're playing using a technique known as circular breathing, which means they fill up their cheeks with air, and then they use that air, that reservoir of air in their cheeks, to go on playing the instruments while they breathe in again through their nose, filling up their lungs. Extraordinary technique. It's actually practiced in many countries throughout the world for playing wind instruments.
And is it used as an accompanying instrument as well?
Yes, it's used to accompany singing, and so we'll listen to an example now of it being used in that way. The story that's being told is called The Creation of the Earth, and it's about a falling star which is burning and falling to earth, creating a waterhole, and that waterhole becoming a sacred place.
Now that's a sound we all know in the West, thanks to the Beatles.
Yes, they made it rather popular, didn't they? And now we all know what a sitar sounds like.
Now, a lot of plucked string instruments sound pretty similar to each other, like the guitar and the lute, for instance. But the sound of the sitar is really distinctive, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The thing about plucked stringed instruments is that once you've plucked the string, the sound immediately starts to die away. So you have a sound that doesn't last for very long, but of course the sound of the sitar goes on for a very long time. This is because it has extra strings running underneath the fretboard called sympathetic strings, which pick up the vibration of the melody note and go on sounding after the melody note has moved on to another melody note.
And how were the melodies composed?
Well, they're fitted together according to very strict rules. So each piece is called a rag, and each rag has very definite rules to it. And out of those series of notes that are appropriate to that rag, people compose little tunes. Those little tunes are then turned into much larger composition by a process of improvisation.
Can you explain to us exactly what improvisation means?
Well, in this context, improvisation is a matter of taking those tunes and developing them according to these very strict rules and within a strict rhythmic framework. So each performer will take a short composition, and every time they play that piece, they will recreate the piece anew.
And so the same piece is never going to sound the same twice.
It could sound very, very different. On the other hand, I don't want to give the impression that a piece of Indian music is completely different every time it's played, because on some occasions they would sound rather similar because they would be following the same format. But there are lots of things that will affect the eventual outcome of a performance. For instance, how the performer felt about what he was playing, what time of day it was, how the audience reacted to his
And so
performance.
also the length of the piece is going to vary, isn't it?
It can. If the audience was not with a performer, the performer may cut off the performance early. On the other hand, if the audience were really with them, and they show this by joining in the rhythms, marking out the rhythms for them, and making vocal appreciative noises. So if the audience is with them, they could go on for a very long time. I've known performances of well over an hour.
So we're talking here about a very complex art.
It's highly complex, and it's also very alive. There are new pieces still being written. The repertoire is continually changing and developing. We'll listen now to the end of the same piece that we listened to earlier, and you'll hear how the sound has now developed so that it's much quicker. It's still using the same notes, which is what makes it the same piece, but it's much, much faster, and it's working itself up to a real conclusion.
That instrument seems to combine both wind and percussive elements. What exactly is it?
It's a gendare, and it comes from Indonesia. And you're right, it does combine wind and percussion. It consists of a series of metal slabs that are suspended over bamboo tubes. And when you hit the metal slab, you initially get the percussive sound, and then that sound is amplified by the column of air inside the bamboo tube. So you get a sound that you would associate more with wind instruments as well.
And when would you expect to hear this instrument?
Well, that particular example you would hear if you went to the shadow puppet theatre.
That music sounds rather more complicated than the sort of music that we'd have with our Punch and Judy shows.
Yes, well, that's because the shadow puppet theatre in Indonesia is nothing at all like our Punch and Judy. It's not a type of theatre intended for children primarily. It's for everybody, the whole community. It is based on long epic stories, and it includes elements of social satire and commentary on contemporary life, as well as clowning and that entertainment side of theatre as well.
So it's real drama rather than puppetry?
Yes, that's right.
Is the instrument ever used as part of an ensemble?
Yes, more typically you would find it in an ensemble called the Gamelan. Now, Gamelan is a very large orchestra consisting mainly of this type of metal percussion instrument, gongs and then also drums. There are several different traditions of gamelan throughout Indonesia. Each island and sometimes different areas within one island will have different traditions of gamelan playing. The style we're listening to here comes from the island of Bali.
But it's the Javanese gamelan which influenced Debussy and other 20th century composers.
That's right. Well, if you think that in the late 19th century there weren't any recordings of this type of music, so composers could only be influenced by music that they actually heard. Now, Debussy and other French composers had the chance of hearing Javanese gamelan because a group of Javanese musicians went to the Paris exhibition in 1889.
So are we going to hear some more now?
Yes, we'll listen now to a piece which is also from the Shadow Puppet Theatre of Bali. This is not a piece of introductory music to do with the characters. This is an interlude that would actually be listened to as part of the performance.
That was a pair of Dernier, metal xylophones from Indonesia. Where does the xylophone as we know it originate from?
Well, that originates in Indonesia. All forms of xylophone the world over, as far as we know, come from that same source, and they've been used there for thousands of years. Some people think that a very long time ago the xylophone was exported from Indonesia to the east coast of Africa, and it's spread now throughout Africa. There's a very distinct style of xylophone playing in Africa, and that style has become part of the structure of African music, and now other instruments have taken on similar forms.
Such as?
Well, such as a type of instrument which is sometimes referred to as a thumb piano. Now, that's a name that the native performers on the instrument very much object to, as they see that as being almost a term of abuse by the imperialist white people who have come in and called their own instrument something that is inferior to white person's piano. The native name for it is the Mbira in Zimbabwe, but it has a number of other names as well, of course.
How many Mbira were playing in that recording?
Well, I think this will come as a surprise to you. There's in fact only one player.
Really?
Yes, using 2 thumbs, that's all.
So it really is a very complicated instrument by the sound of it.
It can be. The style of playing we were listening to there is referred to by the players as being one, because they are actually, the player on that recording is playing music that would normally be played by at least 2 instruments, and he's playing it by himself.
Now, this instrument comes from Zimbabwe, which in recent times has always been associated with politics. Does this mean that the Mbira has been used as a political instrument as well?
Yes, during the struggle for independence, the Mbira became associated with the independence movement. It was seen as a symbol of the strength of the black people against the white minority.
But it sounds very peaceful for fighting music.
Yes, it is, and players often refer to it as making them feel very restful. They say that it puts them in touch with the spirit world, with their ancestors, for instance, and it becomes important as music of resistance because it gives them a sense of their own identity. We're going to listen now to a piece of Mbira music from a ceremony for the ancestral spirits. In this example, the music is used to put people into a frame of mind where they will be able to communicate with their ancestors. The ceremony is called Mbira.
They sound as though they're having a good time.
Yes, and that sort of ceremony can go on all night. And although it's in a way a religious ceremony, they're actually communicating with the spirit world. It is associated with drinking and the taking of drugs, which helps them communicate with their ancestors. And towards the morning, perhaps somebody will become possessed by an ancestral spirit, and then the music will stop for a short time while advice is received from the spirit world, and then the music will continue.
Okay, so where are we off to now?
We're off to China.
Most of us have played a mouth organ at some time or another. Is that what it is?
It is a type of mouth organ. It's called the Sheng, and it originates in China. It's still played there. It's been played there actually for 3,000 years, and it is the forerunner of our own mouth organ, and also that all the instruments that are constructed in the same way as the mouth organ, that is the accordion, the harmonium, the melodeon, the melodica. There's a whole load of instruments that we use which are made in the same way as the Chinese Sheng, and our technology is derived from the Chinese instrument.
That sounds to me a very atmospheric piece of music. What's it about?
It is called Spring on South Mountain, and it is about nature. A lot of Chinese music tries to reflect nature because nature has a very important part in Chinese thought. This particular piece, if we listen to it again, you'll hear how it gives the impression of spring gradually awakening. It starts with very sparse sounds and ends with a type of fullness and bustle and life.
Is the Sheng still popular in China today?
It is popular, but rather than saying it's still popular, I'd say it's popular again, because it actually fell into complete disuse during the early years of communist China. It was associated with religious rituals, which of course were banned when the communists took over. But recently it's been revived. It's played in two ways. It is used to play folk songs, which are thought to be appropriate to the people and the political purpose of the Chinese leaders at the moment, and is also used to play modern revolutionary music, which is composed often not by one person but by composers' collectives. And the music that is produced like this is meant to give people the impression of prosperity and forward movement. For instance, the piece we're going to listen to now is called The Red Flower of Tat Chai Blossoms Everywhere. Now, Tat Chai was a pace-setting commune. In fact, eventually it was found out that it was a fraud. But this piece of music stands as a monument to Tat Chai commune.
That sounds more Western than I expected.
Yes, the Western influence in Chinese music, even the music which is current in communist China, is very strong. And so that obviously was an orchestra which could almost have been a Western orchestra. The tunes themselves sound quite Chinese. They're probably based on Chinese folk song models. But the overall effect is one of a sort of dynamism that you would normally associate with a Western symphony orchestra.
What does the Sheng look like?
Well, it's said to represent the shape of a phoenix, and because of that it has 17 bamboo pipes arranged in a circular fashion. And although it has 17 pipes, in fact 2 or 3 of them don't even have reeds in them and are there for purely decorative reasons, so that they complete the symmetry of the look of the instrument. They have no function at all. It's rather like having piano keys without any strings attached.
Now, how can you call an instrument which is as rhythmically and melodically impotent as that musical?
Well, I suspect that the Sioux Indian playing that instrument would not call it musical either. And the reason for that is probably that he doesn't have a word for music in his language. He probably now knows the English word for music, but in his own language he wouldn't have a word for it, because music isn't seen as anything which has a separate cultural identity. It only ever exists as part of a complex of behaviour which might include dance, the consumption of food, smoking, religion, all sorts of other aspects of culture which we tend to disassociate from music. But in some other cultures, and the American Indians are a good example, they don't make that division between different aspects of culture.
So what's the water drum made of?
It may be made out of pot or metal or wood as a bowl, and then it will have a piece of buckskin soaked in water stretched over the top of it. And the effect of this leather soaked in water is that the higher sounds, which you get off a stretched membrane over a bowl, don't come out. So all you get is what we call the fundamental tone. Now this tone is a very dull sound, but it travels over very long distances. And so people have often commented that the water drum sounds very dull and quite quiet when you're standing close to it, but you can walk a very long way away and you'll still hear it just as loudly.
So presumably the water drum was also used for messages, which is what we normally associate drums and Indians, don't we?
No, the water drum wouldn't be used for messages. In fact, its only function at the moment is as part of religious ceremonies in the Native American church, which is sometimes known as the Peyote religion. The reason for this is that when people take part in these ceremonies, they chew part of a cactus called the Peyote cactus. It's actually a drug. It makes them hallucinate and puts them in touch with either their own ancestors or with characters from Christian religion.
So this drum is still being used today?
Oh, very much so. In fact, its use is on the increase with the development of the Native American church.
Let's finish with something closer to home. That sounds a bit like a Scottish reel.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? But actually, it's music from Norway, and it's played on the Hardanger fiddle.
Fiddle, that means it's like a violin.
Well, it does look a bit like a violin. In fact, it developed out of the violino d'amore, which was a type of violin used in the 16th and 17th century, which, in addition to the strings that you actually play melodies on, has sympathetic strings running underneath the fingerboard.
Like the sitar?
Yes, it's the same idea.
And what sort of music is this instrument mainly used for?
Well, it's used for dance music, Norwegian folk dance music.
Only dance music?
Yes, there isn't any independent repertoire just for listening to.
Hence it sounding like a reel to me.
Yes, and in fact the piece we're going to listen to now is actually in real rhythm. It's a piece called Hailing, and it's a dance for a solo male performer. It's a very energetic dance, and it finishes where he kicks his leg up and kicks the hat off a stick, which is held by a girl who's standing on a chair, so it must be quite high up.
We've travelled several thousand miles. We've heard many different sounds from all over the world. Why did you choose these particular sounds?
Well, I wanted a range of instruments which would represent every continent of the earth, and also every type of instrument that we have there. So we've heard wind instruments, stringed instruments, both plucked stringed instruments and bow stringed instruments. We've heard different types of percussion instruments, those that are played by means of a membrane stretched over a frame, which we normally call drums, and those that we refer to as idiophones, that is, instruments where the sound comes out of the body of the instrument itself, like the Dernier from Bali.
Why do you think it's important that we should learn about other nations' musical cultures?
Well, we live in a shrinking world, don't we, where people inevitably are coming closer together. And if we don't become aware of the differences between us and learn to understand those differences in a sympathetic way, then this leads to conflict. I think it's much more important that we should know about other people and try and appreciate what it is that makes other cultures unique, gives them their particular flavour.
So you're saying that there are musical prejudices to overcome, just as there are in other areas?
I think so. I think that we've probably overcome a few today. As some of the things we listened to, your first reaction was, gosh, that's out of tune, it's not right somehow. But of course it's right in its own context. If you listen to it with open ears, I think you'll come to appreciate something in music from absolutely any culture.